Dr. Cockram at the University Health Center and asked him to recommend someone that I could consult with about some psychiatric disorders I felt I had. I talked with the doctor once for about 2 hours and tried to convey to him my fears that I felt overwhelming, violent impulses. After one season, I never saw the doctor again, and since then, I've been fighting my mental turmoil. Great deal alone stress. And seemingly to no avail. After my death, I wish that an autopsy would be performed on me to see if there is any visible physical disorder. I have had some tremendous headaches in the past and have consumed 2 large bottles of Excedrin in the past 3 months. It was after much thought that I decided to kill my wife, Kathy, tonight, after I picked her up from work at the telephone company. I love her dearly, and she has been as fine a wife to me as any man could ever hope to have. I cannot rationally pinpoint any specific reason for doing this. And he goes on and on. Eventually, his writing becomes so indecipherable that it's really impossible to know what he's talking about. But it's interesting that he said, after I'm dead, I want there to be an autopsy on my brain, because that's exactly what they did. After Whitman was killed, the pathologist took his brain and it was examined in universities. And they found that there was a tumor in his brain, and it was pressing up against a part of his brain known as the amygdala. Now I'm going to show you the amygdala. See in the center of the brain there, that little hot spot, right up there, in the middle, like an island. That is the amygdala. And the amygdala is essentially the area which allows us to understand emotion and experience and see when somebody else is feeling emotions and be able to feel for them, to have sympathy, to have empathy. And so if there is some impediment to the amygdala, then we're impaired in our ability to relate to other people, to feel their pain, to care about them, to have any sympathy or empathy whatsoever. So if this tumor is pressing against Whitman's amygdala, then it seems to be a good explanation as to why he had these sudden homicidal urges. But that's not all. And I'm not saying that Whitman is a psychopath. It could have been just this one defect. But right now, what we're looking at really is the brain of a normal person and the brain of a psychopath. As you can see, the normal person, they have much more activity going through the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, and through the entire limbic system and into the amygdala. Now, if you look at on the right here, the psychopathic brain, there is almost no activity in that prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe, and none in. So what does that mean? Well, physically, it means that there's either damage there or that it never grew in the first place. But ultimately, it's saying that there's some very important areas of the human brain which just simply aren't lighting up. They're not receiving electricity, probably because there's white matter there instead of gray matter. And we've talked about the amygdala being responsible for emotions, but this other part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, it's what regulates our impulses, our drives. So we might feel a drive to hit someone in the face or to say something that we're not supposed to, or to steal a beer from a store. But we are able to check ourselves by having that in place. And that's like almost the gate for those urges. As you can see in the example of the psychopath, that is not functioning. So they don't have the same control over those urges. And when you couple that with their inability to care for another person, to have feelings, to get anything out of a genuine social interaction, then you can start to make sense of them. And I think that's a good way to begin. Before I go any further, I want to point out that though I will often speak as if we're talking about categories, that there are non-psychopaths and psychopaths, it's actually more of a gradient. So if you think of this brain, not all brains are going to be damaged to the same extent or decayed to the same way. I'm sure you can imagine that there's a psychopath that has a little bit more functioning in his or her amygdala or in his or her prefrontal cortex. So really, we're talking about degrees of psychopathy, how psychopathic someone is. This is measured on a test called a PCLR by Dr. Robert Hare. I'm trained to administer that. And I can tell you that the maximum score somebody can get is a 40. We use a score of 30 for cutoffs for research purposes. That's in North America. In Europe, they lower the bar 25. And the average person has a psychopathy score of just 5. It's been argued, actually, by Grant Harris most predominantly, but by increasingly more and more people, that psychopathy, it can be gained through head injury. Obviously, those parts of your brains can be working, and all of a sudden you get damaged and stop working. There can be degenerative diseases that cause that. So, there's usually never one explanation for anything. But guys like Grant Harris have actually argued that it can be inherited genetically. And there seems to be more and more evidence for this. And psychopathy, he has argued, could actually be a sort of deviant evolutionary strategy. And we can talk about that as we go through some of the psychopathic features. Here is a pretty good argument for it, I think. If you recognize the face here, you're looking at the face of America's most prolific mass murderer using a firearm. This is Stephen Craig Paddock, the infamous Las Vegas gunman. He was 64 years old. On October the 1st, 2017, he had a room at Mandalay Bay Hotel and Casino on the Vegas Strip, and he decided to set up any number of semi-automatic weapons, assault rifles and such, and he aimed them down at people attending a country music concert below. He even made mathematical calculations about the trajectory of the bullets to maximize damage. He opened fire, and by the time he was done, he had killed 58 people. So we were talking yesterday about, in 2007, Sung-Hoo Cho had killed 32, and had sort of topped the leaderboards, to be crass. But no, he got 58 killed and over 850 injured. The police got to his hotel room. He'd already killed himself by that point. So I don't know for a fact that Stephen Craig Paddock was a psychopath. He certainly was psychopathic, but here's some information that a lot of people aren't aware of. The man on the left here is his brother, Bruce Paddock. And less than a month after Stephen Paddock committed his mass murder, Bruce Paddock was arrested in West Hollywood and charged with possessing over 600 images of child pornography. This guy here on the right is the father of Stephen and Bruce Paddock, Benjamin Paddock. Benjamin Paddock was a serial bank robber. In 1960, he was arrested and incarcerated for it. He escaped in 1969 and ended up on the FBI's most wanted list. So this guy is a career criminal. He has one son who commits the worst mass murder by firearms in American history, and another son who is arrested and charged with possessing child pornography. Now, what a lot of people would tell you is they say, well, it's the way that he raised them. Obviously, if you've got a bad dad, he's going to raise you to be a criminal. Criminal dad raises criminal sons. But let's think about this a little deeper. Are these crimes at all the same? I would argue that they have nothing in common. Bank robbery and property crimes. Yeah, you could, if his sons had grown up to be bank robbers, you could make that argument, but they didn't. Mass murder is qualitatively much different than that. And child pornography possession is really a kind of form of sex crime. It's different than both of them. So beyond the fact of these guys being related and all being criminals, what is it that they have in common? Well, I don't know, but I think a good hypothesis is that they may have genetically inherited some sort of psychopathic gene, whether that is sort of full-blown psychopathy or halfway. But this is just to illustrate the genetic argument for psychopathy. So we're talking about that PCLR, that checklist by Robert Hare, and there are 20 items on it. And we score the items either 0 for not present, 1 for somewhat present, or 2 for, yeah, that's extremely present in this person. And so I'm going to look at that little list with you. And this should be useful for you guys in your own life, not only just in understanding criminals as we move through this series of lectures. But actually, when you start meeting people in your own life who may cause you trouble or are causing you trouble, and trying to figure out what is wrong with this person. I've had it happen to me since learning this stuff. I've realized there's certain people I had to get out of my life because they were psychopathic. And that was why I was always having problems with them. So the psychopathic checklist revised is divided into sort of 4 broad parts. And the most important one is an affective facet, which contains 4 items. When we talk about affective, we're talking about the emotional life of a person. So we're talking about that part which relates to the amygdala or the lack of activity in the amygdala. So if you have a lack of activity in the amygdala, it's unsurprising that psychopaths have a lack of empathy. They don't emotionally relate to what other people are feeling. They might be able to intellectually process it and understand it. They observe it. They logically go, oh, that person feels sad or in pain, but it doesn't resonate with them at the level that it would a normal person. For the same reason, they tend not to feel guilt or remorse. How can you feel remorse when you simply are incapable of caring? If you do something bad and you have no capacity of feeling beyond the most basic animal levels, things like rage, frustration, if you have no depth of feeling, how could you possibly feel something as complex as remorse? Psychopaths also fail to accept responsibility for their actions. And one is because they don't feel the guilt. So they're not overcome with this desire to take responsibility for their actions. But if they do, sometimes the evidence is so clear against them, they'll just be like, yeah, okay. And there's always a but, right? This is the thing. So yeah, sure, I killed that woman, but she was wearing a really short skirt. Who does that at night? I mean, you're asking for it. Yeah, okay, I robbed that house and burned it down, but they're insured, so nobody really loses out. And so then you have others that will just blanket deny it. You can put the evidence like, look, here's photographs of people skinned alive in your living room. Okay, this is what we found. Nope, not me. What do you mean it's not you? You were covered in their blood. They were skinned alive in the living room. No, it wasn't me. I was set up. That is part of the psychopathic mindset. And then finally, of the affective, one that I think is probably the most difficult to understand of all the psychopathic items, but one that's one of the most fascinating and useful, is what we call a shallow affect. So you've probably heard of a flat affect. That's when someone's face is just always sort of in the same resting emotionless pose. Well, psychopaths are kind of like that because, as I said, they don't have an inner emotional life. They don't relate to other people. You and I can have a great time conversing, assuming we're both not psychopathic. We find inherent value just in us talking and relating to other people. They don't get that. And so they're always sort of emotionally dead, and that shows on their face. They're flat. So what happens is they learn to imitate what normal people are like. You've probably seen this in movies, the guy practicing emotions in the mirror. I believe it might have been in Nightcrawler, which is probably one of the best portrayals of psychopathy I've ever seen if you want to see what a true cinematic depiction of a psychopath. But so they have what we would call a shallow affect. They might be smiling 1 minute, or they seem that they're really concerned. But if you watch them long enough, you'll notice that these aren't really genuine. It's not genuine happiness. It's not genuine concern or sadness. It's a face they're putting on. And if you watch, you'll see every once in a while a little slip, and it just goes back to that blankness. So that's why we call it shallow affect. It's not real. It is masks of emotion that they wear. Another aspect of psychopathy from the PCLR is the interpersonal. And a lot of this either results from the affective or it compensates for it. So psychopaths have what we would call a superficial kind of charm. They're very good at knowing what you want to hear and telling you it. They don't mean it at all. But because they spend this time cultivating a mask, a face, they learn to be very charming, and they can look at someone and they can go, what is this? What would I say to this person to endear them to me? But psychopaths are always playing a short-term game. They're always looking for immediate rewards rather than long-term rewards. So they'll only be able to keep this charm up for so long before they show their real selves to you. But by that time, it may be too late, and you might be one of their victims. Keep in mind as we move on to conning and manipulative, which is something else that psychopaths do constantly, that your only value to a psychopath is what they can use you for. They don't get any value from your personality, from interacting with you. Maybe you're just a hole that they put their penis in. Maybe you're just a cash machine that they take money from or defraud. Maybe they just use you and trick you into committing a crime. They use this charm and this lack of remorse against you, and they get extraordinarily conning and manipulative. I said that not all psychopaths are murderers. In fact, most of them aren't. You can obviously see a lot of these traits in the white-collar population. You hear about these white-collar criminals, your Bernie Madoffs or whatever. They have no remorse for destroying the economy, resulting in dozens of suicides, of hundreds of families going bankrupt, losing their homes. No remorse whatsoever. They're not serial killers, but they've still got all these traits, the superficial charm, conning and manipulative. Wolf of Wall Street, think of that guy, Jordan Belfort. And they love themselves. They have a grandiose sense of themselves because they are the only person that they can relate to. They have no capacity to understand you emotionally, and they're extraordinarily selfish. And so it will always be about them. If they're in a social setting, they'll want to bring it back to them ultimately. They might play that they're listening to you for a while, but at the end of the day, very self-centered. They have a view of themselves, an opinion of themselves, that they are a fantastic, powerful, or important person, that oftentimes their achievements in life, it doesn't support that view at all. And this sort of what we could call grandiose sense of self, I think could be genuine in that they're just so sort of emotionally blank that they're incapable of the introspection to go, you know what, I'm not actually that good. Or in the case of some, such as like your Ted Bundy or your Edmund Kempers, it's actually compensating for a deep sense of feeling of alienation and inferiority, because they see you guys interacting and enjoying and getting along, and they don't know what makes other human beings tick. And they just know that they're different. And so they might start to realize that they're a defective unit, that there's something not wrong. And in typical narcissistic fashion, they overcompensate for it by saying, well, actually, I'm superior. That's what it is. And because they are charming and manipulative, and they have absolutely no regard for the truth or for being consistent, and they take great delight actually in fooling people, they are pathological liars. This is one of the most constant traits about a psychopath. And so they'll lie because they get what you would call something called duping delight. You can actually watch some of them. They're telling a lie, and for a moment they'll have a little smile that gets onto their face if you watch closely. And they're enjoying tricking you. That makes them feel smarter than you. Everyone else is stupid and I'm also clever because I can lie. That's the way they think. And whereas many of us, if we're caught in a, let's say, bold-faced lie, we're going to be taken aback a bit. We're going to feel some shame. We're going to either admit to it and go, yeah, you know what, you got me. I was full of shit. Or we're going to at least sort of be flustered for a second. We're going to be like, before we come up with some excuse or some explanation. Psychopath just skips over that like a rock across the water. Ba-doom, ba-doom, ba-doom. You catch them in a lie, no problem. Even if they don't have an answer, they'll change the topic. I think that we should take a look at that. So of these these 8 traits that I've discussed, you can see a lot of them actually in the upcoming interview here with John Wayne Gacy. We talked about him briefly last lecture, serial killer of at least 33 young men in the 70s in Chicago. And here's an interview with him with a Channel 2 News reporter. And this Channel 2 News reporter is asking him about his victims. Now Gacy denies that he ever killed anyone. It's funny. He makes a full confession to the police, and then he just goes back on it. And then he goes, "So no, actually, I didn't kill anyone." And then in another instance, yeah, okay, I killed one guy, but he was coming at me, and so I stabbed him. It was self-defense. Then I went to go put his body down in the crawl space. That's when I noticed all the other bodies in the crawl space. I didn't know where they came from, but I was like, you know what? I don't want any part of that. So I just let it go. So he's got a million different versions of his story. By this time, 1992, I think he's pretty much going with full blown, I didn't do any of them. There just happened to be bodies in my crawl space, 28 of them to be exact. And it was when he ran out of room there and had to start throwing them in the river that he got caught. But watch this interview with him where he gets caught in a lie and how quickly he just glosses over it.
What was happening in the Vukovic case? Where was he picked up, and how did he get to the house, and what happened with him?
I don't want to go into the other the five that I know about. Just take it that I did. Vukovic is not one that I killed, so I don't know nothing about him. The little bit that I know about him is that he was an employee of mine. See, when you look about this recall business, and
I'm not a prosecutor, John, but you just
I know you're not. Wait a minute.
Is not one that you killed, which suggests that maybe in fact there were others that you did kill. I mean, I'm not.
Okay, I'm sorry if I led you to believe. No, strike it then. That is wrong.
Did you guys just hear that? I'm sorry if I slipped up and actually told the truth for a second that I had killed people, but just strike that from the conversation. That was a mistake. If I led you to believe that, in other words, I screwed up, then it was just an error on my part. You know, that's how quickly he lies. It was almost without pause, right? We have other aspects of the psychopath. They tend to think about what it would be like to have no inner emotional life, to never be able to feel love or kinship with anyone, or every situation. You can't appreciate something like the beauty of nature or the richness of art. You're just kind of dead inside. Well, they're constantly seeking sensation. They're prone to boredness. They need stimulation constantly. And so you'll find them doing everything from crimes like shoplifting or robbing banks just to get an adrenaline high, just to get a kick. Or if you find them in a social situation, oftentimes they'll cause problems just to break the monotony. You know, they use drugs and alcohol recklessly. They'll go trying extreme sports. One thing I should clarify is, like, you are probably looking at some of these traits and you're saying, well, that's me. Are you saying that I'm a psychopath? The point is, no. We all have some of these traits, but psychopaths have pretty much all of them or a lot of them. It's a pattern of behavior, which is all linked to this impoverished inner life. And so, yes, they sensation seek for that reason. They're impulsive. What we talked about, that the prefrontal cortex is not working right with them. So they have an idea to do something. What the hell? That they just do it. And then there it is. Why did you do that? I don't know. I just felt like it. And irresponsibility. This applies mostly to finances. And once again, this is probably what you'll see a lot in the white-collar psychopaths, but also in a lot of blue-collar ones too. So they rack up a huge debt, or they max out their credit cards, or they owe this person money here, this person money there. They never, ever entertain the thought of paying that back. Once again, what is it? It's all short-term gains. They're never thinking about the long game. And that is like the crucial folly of the psychopath. They think that they're so clever because they can win in the short term, but they're never thinking beyond that first stage. And so, yeah, ultimately their financial irresponsibility is going to catch up with them. Because of this same reason, they have no realistic long-term goals. Let me tell you about a guy we had in Canada called Michael Hector. Michael Hector was a serial bank robber. Bank robbery is pretty serious. I mean, robbery implies that you go in and you threaten someone, and probably with a weapon. I believe in his case, it certainly was with a weapon. Hey, give me the money. So this is a serious crime. And he had been incarcerated for this, and he came up for parole. And they asked him, well, you know, what are your plans, Michael, if you get out of jail? He said, well, I'm going to move to the east coast of Canada, and I'm going to become an author. Okay. Have you ever written anything in your life? Have you looked into the book industry? Are you aware that it's almost impossible to make a living as a writer. I am. I've written 5 books. You have to get very lucky to be a professional author. And he just has this sort of half-baked idea that I'll move out east and I'll write books and they'll just give me money. And this should have been a big red flag for the people at the parole board. He's got no plan. He's got no plan to adapt, which is going to last. But unfortunately, they still let him out. And within a few months of being out, he had killed 3 people, killed 2 guys in their home to take their cocaine, and killed, I think it was a attendant at a gas station, probably just because he felt like it. And so I would say that Michael Hector, though I can't be sure, is most likely a psychopath. And he's incarcerated today. If you were to let him out in 10 years, he'd probably do something again, because you can't rehabilitate something that is organically wrong with someone. And also, psychopaths are parasites. Look, they don't want to work. They, like I said, everything's short term. So whether they're leeching off a family member or a friend or social services, they're always looking at people as vehicles. Like, how can I use this person to get the money or that I need for this, or get a roof over my head? I'm certainly not going to go to work for it, because that's boring, and I need stimulation all the time, the sensation seeking. So hopefully you're beginning to see how these 2 things, just the deficit of empathy and the malfunction of the prefrontal cortex, impulse regulation, manifests in all these other behaviors. It's they may do evil things, but it's not evil. It makes sense from a psychological point of view. And then, of course, the most objective, we get into their genuine antisocial behaviors. So many of them will have what we call poor behavioral controls. Maybe you've met someone like this. It's terrifying. The type of person who will be fine 1 minute. Maybe they'll be sitting at the dinner table with you, okay? And the next thing you know, they go from 0 to a 10. They totally explode. Their temper goes off. They're like ready to kill someone. Maybe they do hit someone. Maybe they do hurt someone. And then in the next second, they just return back to being like they were. It's like they can explode into rage without their heart rate changing. This is what we're talking about with poor behavioral controls, just ungovernable rage that boom blasts out and then just comes back in. What's the problem? The turkey's all over the floor, the table's flipped over. They have early behavioral problems from a kid, whether it's hurting animals, bullying other kids, stealing things, setting fires. We see that. They're juvenile delinquents. They often have criminal records in their teenage years for all sorts of things. They are versatile criminals. This is one of the things I note the most, which is most important. So it's rare that you get a psychopath who just burgles houses or just kills people, right? They have their fingers in so many pies. They're committing crimes and transgressions so pathologically and frequently that you'll have a psychopath that's like, yeah, I committed grievous bodily harm against this guy, and then I robbed this bank, and then I got a charge for fraud here, drunk driving a bunch of times. It's basically they have a whole buffet of criminal activities. It's not just the one thing they do. They are criminally versatile. And finally, under the antisocial facet, if they're on parole or they're on a day pass, or they're in prison, they often violate that. So, like, if you think of Ted Bundy, he escaped prison twice, right? The parole, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's just an opportunity for them to get away. So if you see a person with a pattern of breaking out of jail or violating their parole, that also may be indicative of a psychopath. Finally, these last 2, they don't actually fit into any of the 4 main facets, but they are 19 and 20. And one is sexual promiscuity. And I know what you're thinking. You're going, shit, man, what's wrong with sexual promiscuity? Like, either you're already doing it and you're having a good time, or you'd like to be doing it, but just can't, right? Once again, I'm not saying that being sexually promiscuous is psychopathy, not at all. But if you think of somebody who is out to seek constant novelty, constant thrills, new stimulus, and that they are completely unable to attach emotionally to another person, right? then it makes sense that they would also be sexually promiscuous. They can use that charm, that conning, that short-term game ability that they've developed to pick people up, to endear people to themselves and make them fall in love with them in the short term. But then the real them comes out and they cheat. They're with a different person every night. They commit sex crimes. They have all kinds of weird fetishes and paraphilia. It's all related to the traits that we talked about before. And then, of course, if they do get married, whether it's common law or legit, they can't maintain that relationship because they are driven to seek out novelty once again. They're impulsive. They don't care about the person they're in the relationship with. And so they'll go through wives or girlfriends or, husbands or boyfriends. They're female psychopaths too. They'll just go through them like bang, bang, one after the other, sometimes 3, 4, whatever have you. So those are the 20 items that we look at when we're trying to assess whether somebody is a psychopath. As I said, if you get a score of 30 or higher in North America, you can be used as like a research subject. And it's lower in Europe. It's 25. I lean towards 25. I think 25 we're starting to get into like pretty clear psychopathy range. And so interviewing a psychopath, this is really interesting because as you saw with Gacy, and you're going to see in more examples, they can be very evasive. You want to talk to them about X, and they'll find a way to move it to Y, B, Z, A, all over the place. They're like jelly. You can't hold them down in an interview. They're constantly squirming away. They're always trying to dictate the pace. And they do this through excessive talking. A psychopath is a consummate blabbermouth. It's just all the time. I've actually been in front of one. It's dizzying. Like it really is. They're talking so much about so many topics that are unrelated so quickly that you almost just go into a trance and you have a hard time paying attention to them. So, and there's also a grandiosity when they speak to you. It's like they're a king holding court, even if they're in the worst situation possible. They could be sitting in a prison cell and you're an authority figure. You have total power over them, but they don't act like that. They act like they're the one that's in control. They use gestures a lot to distract you. Hey, am I making myself clear? What is the fundamental issue, right? What we need to do is this. This is just another part of their style. Why they do that, I don't know. Maybe it's because they can't emote with their face naturally, or they struggle with that, or maybe it's some way of distracting people, like a cobra being hypnotized. And they will always take control of the conversation, and you've got to expect that to happen. And what you do is you let them think they've taken control of it, and you let them blab and blab and blab. Okay, so everything we've just talked about, look for this in this video with Paul Bernardo. Let me tell you a little bit about Paul Bernardo if you don't know. This is probably the most hated man in Canadian history, to be honest with you. Paul Bernardo was the infamous Scarborough rapist. He raped dozens of women in the Toronto suburb of Scarborough between 1986 or 87 and 90. And these were brutal rapes. We're talking about oral penetration, anal penetration, vaginal penetration, put in the most humiliating order imaginable because he got off on humiliating them. He'd make the women call themselves a bitch, slut, all the other kinds of words that you can imagine. He would rub dirt into their hair. He would cut them. He would strangle them with a black coaxial cable, really hurt them, beat them badly. Death. And unsurprisingly went on to become a serial killer. He killed, with the help of his partner, Karla Homolka, who, that's a whole other story. We just won't talk about that. Very controversial character in Canada. But with the help of his girlfriend and later wife, Karla Homolka, he raped and killed Karla's younger sister, Tammy, in 1990. And then he abducted Leslie Mahaffey in 1991 from Burlington, the suburbs, took her back to the home he shared with Karla, raped and tortured her over a period of 24 hours, videotaped the whole thing, then shut off the video camera and strangled her to death with the black coaxial cable. And then in 1992, he did the same. He abducted Kristen French, a schoolgirl in St. Catharines, Ontario, took her back to the house, kept her longer, subjected her to all manners of sexual abuse, degradation, and torture, and ultimately killed her too. I should say also in the case of Leslie Mahaffey, he dismembered her body and encased it in concrete. And the body, just a little bit of info here, was found on his wedding day to Carla. The same day they were getting married, they found these blocks out in the lake. So this is a pretty evil dude. The interview that you're going to see with him here, they're asking him about other sexual assaults that he claimed to do. Now they're just trying, it's the police. He's already arrested. He's already caught. And so just before we move on to that, what I'll do is I'll go back to these interviewing the psychopath. Remember, evasiveness, excessive and grandiose talking, distracting gestures, takes control of conversation. Okay, watch this and take note.
There was none that I thought that you didn't do. There was some that I didn't have enough information to either identify the offense because you were unable to provide enough details at that time, or they may not have ever been reported to the police. As you said when we spoke, some of them were, we'll call them minor type offenses, but offenses that may not have been reported to the police.
Okay, problem. I turned on the TV, I waited for Peel Regional to come by. September rolls around, they make a public announcement. It's written on my file here that I lied to police and I did not commit the crimes that I said I committed on the offenses in Peel Region.
Okay.
Big problem.
I have spoken to Peel Region,
yeah.
And
see how bored he looks?
They have told me that they don't have enough information at this point to identify anything that you've, the letter that was sent to the police, or through to the police, wasn't specific enough to identify any offenses. Now that's something that we can talk about sort of following this interview, and if you want to get into that, we can talk about
Here we go.
Well, I've been sitting with this for years, and it's written on my file, and it makes me seem like, oh, he's just this crazy. You guys love doing that. I'm this crazy psychopathic liar. Why was that statement issued? Why didn't they come in and talk to me if they didn't have enough information? We were waiting on that tape. You can play that tape back. I asked you guys, is Peel Regional going to come in? I sat there month after month after month. No one came. I turned on the TV in September. Peel, declared that Paul Bernardo was, this crazy liar to police. What's the fundamental problem here?
Well,
I mean, truth, justice, the Canadian way, and no one comes in, and now you guys are saying that you didn't have enough information.
Well, I can't answer for them specifically as to what they did. Or
Boring. Draw circles on the table.
I can tell you that because they're a separate police department, I don't have any control over what investigation.
Looks out the window.
I can tell you that I have spoken.
It's not listening to him.
An investigator in Peel Region, and they have told me that at this point they don't have enough information to move forward. They haven't been able to identify any offense that was specifically talked about.
That statement you're giving me is much different from the public statement they said, which said I was a liar.
Okay, well, I don't.
There's night and day, and they didn't come in. If they didn't have enough information, why don't you come in and get the information?
Absolutely.
I mean, either I'm lying or I'm not lying. And this goes to the crux of this argument. Either I'm a liar to you, I'm going to lie to you right now about everything, like I did to Peel Regional, according to their story, or I'm not. I'm not going to sit here and come voluntarily and have people come. You guys ban me from the press. You roll your stories over and constantly say that I'm a liar. I'm a liar. I made mistakes 17 years ago. Okay, fine, I did. But now we're talking about today, and you're not going to roll forward that I'm some psychopathic liar sitting in jail claiming other people's responsibilities for other crimes. This is a total cross-examination point. You want to start this thing? Locklear's going to grab a hold of it and say, well, he lied about other crimes. He's a crazy liar. Why didn't you guys resolve this?
And again, I can't answer for what Peel Region did or didn't do.
Jurisdictionally, we're kind of bound as to what takes place.
But still, the good guys, the bad guys. You know what I mean? You're on the same team.
There you go. You should have caught most of the behaviors I was talking about there. See the way he's sitting there. Like, can you imagine talking to police officers like that? It's like he's acting like he's not even arrested for what he does, that he's not in their power, that he's just giving them the benefit of his time, that they're lucky to be in his presence, and they're idiots and they're doing everything wrong. What's the fundamental problem? Are you guys stupid? just completely takes over the conversation. And I think what's really telling is he says, I made some mistakes 17 years ago. Let's remember what those mistakes were. Those mistakes were dozens of sadistic rapes. Those mistakes were the murders of at least 3 teenage schoolgirls in which they were repeatedly raped, tortured. This was filmed on videotape for his sexual pleasure later, and then murdered and their bodies desecrated. I made some mistakes 17 years ago, right? So how do you interview a psychopath? How do you do it right? Well, I've tried some of this out, and I've been pretty successful with it so far, but I do need to, admittedly, I need to talk to more. What you don't try and do is you don't try to appeal to their decency. This is when someone had interviewed Bernardo before he was incarcerated. They actually did this, and I can't believe they made this rookie mistake. They said, come on, don't you have any decency, man? Just admit to what you did. Don't you care? And of course he doesn't care. They didn't realize what a psychopath was. They didn't realize who they were speaking to. Okay? He doesn't care. He doesn't have any emotional life at all. He doesn't lose any sleep over what he's done. In fact, he probably gets off to it. So do not appeal to their sense of decency. Oh, don't try and intimidate them either. There's a great story about Dave Reichert, who was chasing the Green River Killer for years and years and years. This is a really tough cop. This guy, then went on to get political office. This is a formidable guy. And he got into a staring contest with the Green River Killer. Once he had caught the Green River Killer, he was advised not to do this by an FBI agent, but he still did. Well, guess who lost the staring contest, right? Psychopathic person is always going to win. You're not going to intimidate them, okay? So don't appeal to decency, and you're not going to intimidate them because they're just not scared. They will invade your personal space. We have a serial killer of 11 children in Canada called Clifford Olson, and a psychiatrist went in to see him, and he was interviewing him. He was writing notes, just with his head down like this, making notes. And the next thing he knows, he feels an arm on the back of his shoulder. Clifford Olson has managed to slink quietly out of his seat, get around the back of him, and touch him on the shoulder. And that's a message in there. It's like, hey, I could kill you. I'm not going to, but I just want you to know that. I also know people that Clifford Olson would call their homes. People, psychologists and criminologists that had spoken with him, he would find a way to get their number, call their homes and talk to their children. Hey, Daddy, Cliff's on the phone. He wants to talk to you. What? Clifford Olson? Do appeal to the ego of the psychopath. This is something I've already kind of touched upon. Give him a soapbox. Let him blab. He loves the sound of his own voice, and you got to learn to be patient. And as I said, it can be hard to pay attention because it's just blah, 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 all these kind of topics. 95% of it's going to be junk, but 5% they're going to start revealing things about themselves to you. And so just hang in there, have a plan, and slowly nudge the conversation in that way. And remember, appeal to their ego, their grandiosity. So for an example, you know what a fascinating thing that you just said was, Cliff? It's this. And I'd love to hear more about that. You're one of the more interesting guys, aren't you? Because we all know you killed more people than they got you for. I mean, how are you such a great predator, right? What is it that sets you apart from the others? Even if they know that they shouldn't talk about it, they can't help themselves because they're so grandiose. I'm going to show you now how not to interview a psychopath. This is a textbook example of how to screw up by famed interviewer Charlie Rose against Charles Manson. Personal space.
Watching you on the tube. What do you think? Everything. Nothing.
Evasiveness.
Let me sit here. How's your day going?
Day's going nice. The weather here is much better than the weather in Washington, D.C. We left 4 inches of snow. And I got out here and they said this is the record warm temperatures for...
Yeah, I'm kind of nervous. I've been locked up in the hole a long time. So for me to come out of that cell, it's a whole brand new experience.
And what's the prison routine like for you?
I sit in my cell 24 hours a day.
Do you read?
No.
Why not?
Well, I found my thoughts are more interesting than anything I can read.
There's your chance.
Watch any television?
No.
Occasionally.
Screwed up, Charlie.
I watch, I spin it around a lot. I watch a little bit of everything.
Listen to radio?
When I have one, yeah.
Have any friends you talk to?
I'm friend to everything I see, everything I know, everything I feel.
What about other inmates?
I'm brother in these hallways for 40 years with no snitching on my jacket, and no asking for nobody to protect me, and walking on my own 2 feet.
You get a lot of mail.
Yeah.
What do they say? Those letters.
Everybody's playing a different game with the thought. They're playing boats and planes and trains and rabbits and ducks and swings and hearts and little girls and everything that you can think of. When we started the Rainbow, the Rainbow, all the thoughts that go with the seed grows up from the ground. Everything that grows starts and grows up. You go down in the earth to plant something, and you plant these seeds, and this garden grows. It's the same thing with the garden that's in the mind.
I want to talk about that, but let me stay with the routine of your life for a while.
I want to talk about that, Charlie, but let's stay with the routine. Right, the moment when he should have struck, the moment when he had his opportunity, was when he asked Manson, "Do you read any books?" And Manson said no, because the ideas I have in my own head, I find them to be the more interesting. Well, how do you get him to talk? How do you get him to talk about what he's thinking, what he's feeling? How do you appeal to his grandiosity and start to steer the direction, the conversation in the direction you want to? Well, the correct reply to that would have been, well, you know, Charlie, I'm fascinated to know what those thoughts are, actually. Why don't you tell me about some of the things you're thinking? But no, he goes on, he says, do you watch anything on TV? You know, what's the routine like in the prison? The minute Charlie starts to open up, he's like, well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later. But now I want to ask you, like, this other talking point that I've got on my interview sheet. That's not how you do it. You have to know what a psychopath is and keep those rules I taught you in mind, and you roll with it organically. Psychopathic violence, you'll often see, we learned last time about the difference between instrumental violence and reactive violence. Psychopaths are capable of both, but they're overrepresented as criminals who can commit acts of instrumental violence, that is premeditated, goal-oriented violence. Most of us cannot do that, to commit violence in cold blood. They do it without their heartbeat changing. The violence is gratuitous, overkill, mutilation, torture, and ultra-violence, let's call it that, to use the Clockwork Orange term. And what I think is probably most telling is what I call equal opportunity victimization. So whether you're a man or a woman, a kid, someone in middle age, a young adult, a pensioner, whatever it is, whatever your sexuality or race, they don't really care, right? As I said, they don't bond with you. They don't have any feelings inside. Everyone to them is just a vehicle, a means to get to something else. So therefore, they will victimize anyone. It's equal opportunity. Let me give you 3 examples. I was talking about Clifford Olson before, the consummate psychopathic killer who invaded the space of the psychiatrist, who killed the 11 children in British Columbia, Canada from 1980 to 1981. His youngest victim was a 9-year-old boy who he sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered. And then I think his oldest victim may have been as old as 20 or 18, 19, 20, somewhere in that area. And she was a female. And then he had all male and females of various ages in between those two. So it didn't matter, male or female, before puberty, after puberty, it didn't matter. If Cliff wanted you, if he had his opportunity, he would strike and you would be a victim of his deviant, violent sexuality and then be murdered. This is the same in the UK. So we've got a Canadian case there. Cliff is like the poster boy for psychopathy. His score is something like a 36. Another guy close to that, Ian Brady in the UK, once again, range of his victims. This is the infamous Moors murderer. From 1963 to 65, he kills at least 5 people. His youngest victim is 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey, a female. His oldest victim is a 17-year-old male. And his victims are pretty much even male, female, all between in that series and of all different ages. He all but one of them he sexually assaults and tortures. And then you have it in America with the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, kills 14 people, seriously wounds another 5 between 1984 and 85 in Los Angeles and a little sojourn into San Francisco in the United States. He rapes children. He rapes old ladies. He rapes women in between. He mutilates people. He cuts their eyes out of their head. He chops their body parts off. He tortures them. He kills the man of the house. He targets the house, not the person. Anyone inside, they're dead. They're fair game. Walks in, sees a man getting out of bed, bang, shoots him in the head. Threat dealt with. Now I can do whatever I want with the women and children. Equal opportunity victimization. We're getting near the end here, but I should definitely touch on psychosis. So we're done with psychopathy for now. Psychosis is much different. Psychosis is losing touch with reality. Psychopaths are pretty much in touch with reality. They know what's right and what's wrong. They just simply don't care because they can't relate to people. Somebody who's psychotic, it's like being in a constant dream or taking 100 hits of acid, something like that. They are not functioning in the world as is. So some psychotic features, delusions. Delusion is the belief in something that is irrational, and no matter what evidence that you're presented with to the contrary, you find a way to rationalize it away and still maintain the same belief. So you could say flat earth theory is a part of this. You go, okay, well, you think the earth's flat. Here's a view of the earth from outer space taken by a satellite. Oh, okay, well, that's fake. Okay, well, did you know that sailors can see the arc of the horizon when they're sailing? Oh, that's fake too. Okay, you realize that hundreds of millions, if not billions of people would have to be in on this conspiracy theory. All pilots, all politicians, all military, like all these people would have to be in on it. Yeah, well, they always have a reason, right, to keep maintaining the theory. That is delusion in essence. Hallucinations, well, that speaks for itself. They can be visual hallucinations, you see things that aren't there, or audio hallucinations, you hear things that aren't there, voices in your ears telling you to do things. Magical thinking is an interesting one. Magical thinking is when you believe that you can cause things to happen. You have like a deficiency in understanding cause and effect. So perhaps you're watching TV and, I don't know, Jimmy Kimmel's on TV, and you go, "Oh, shut up, Jimmy Kimmel." And then just coincidentally, Jimmy Kimmel goes quiet. Rather than just maybe having a chuckle to yourself and going, "Oh, what's the chances of that?" They'll be like, "Well, no, I can control Jimmy Kimmel. I can make him go quiet or not." Or they might think, 2 days ago, I was thinking about how we haven't had rain in a while, and today it rained. Therefore, I caused it to rain. And it can be just a coincidence. They just find these patterns and they believe it's them. And they're also disorganized in their speech. You might have heard the term word salad. a psychotic person will speak to you and the words will be coming out, but they won't be in any order that makes any kind of sense. A lot of homeless people you'll encounter will exhibit this. You might be talking to them about subject X and they answer with something completely unrelated, like they're unable to follow the conversation. And of course, if you have this much going on, it's going to manifest in your behavior too. Let's look at a case of psychopathic violence. This is the infamous Slender Man stabbing. Happened May 31st, 2014 in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Both of these girls, the girl on the left here, this is Anissa Weier. She's 12, and this is her friend Morgan Geyser, also 12. And they were, friends in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and they had this interest in Slender Man. Now, as we're in Sansar, I'm going to assume that most of you know who Slender Man is. But for those of you who don't, Slender Man is kind of like a boogeyman that grew up on the internet, on the Something Awful forums, and he entered the creepypasta sites. He's like depicted as a tall, lanky, faceless figure, and he comes after children, and sometimes tentacles come out of his back, and the more you know about him, the more he knows about you. It's actually a pretty cool, creepy concept. But whereas people like you and I can just enjoy the creep factor of that, the mythical quality of it, well, these girls believed he was real, and that's because Morgan Geyser, the one on the right there, is a paranoid schizophrenic, and Anissa Weier, the one on the left, was diagnosed with something called shared delusional disorder, which is a whole other kettle of fish, but basically she was delusional. They thought Slender Man was real, and they believed that Slender Man would come and kill them and their families in 5 seconds unless they made a sacrifice to Slender Man. So they decided upon their friend Peyton Lautner. They invited Peyton over for a sleepover. They tried to do it then, but they couldn't work up the nerve. So the next day, they took her out into the woods to play hide and seek. And once she was isolated from other people, they pulled out a butcher knife, 5-inch one, stabbed her 19 times. They then left. Peyton wasn't dead. She was a tough cookie. She crawled up to the road. They thought they'd killed her. Peyton crawled up to the road, flagged down a motorist, was taken to the hospital and lived. Meanwhile, Anissa and Morgan are walking along the highway to Nicollet National Forest because part of their delusion, their psychosis, is now that they've sacrificed their friend Slender Man, that that he will appear to them in Nicollet National Forest and that he will take them to go live in his mansion forever. So ultimately, both girls are found basically not criminally responsible. They're insane in the legal terminology, and they receive hefty sentences, but they're treated more like psychiatric patients than they are. And as you can see, they're very different in their approach to the crime than the psychopath. They're motivated not by gratification, but by a delusion. So just to end, we can have, we talked yesterday about how the difference between mass murderers and serial killers. We talked about spree killers too, and bifurcated mass murderers and mass shooters, but I'll keep it simple. You can have a psychopathic mass murderer. Meet Richard Speck. You've probably seen him on Mindhunter. In 1966, Richard Speck went into a dormitory in Chicago. We don't know why he went in. He may have gone in to rob, might have gone in for something darker, but he encountered a nurse in there, decided to rape her and murder her, either stabbed or strangled her to death. But as he's doing this, more nurses keep coming in. And so he's got a gun and he's using it to take control of all these nurses. He's tying them up and he's placing them in different parts of the dormitory. And he eventually kills 8 nurses through stabbing or strangling them, just methodically, one after the other. The first one probably wanted to rape her and kill her to eliminate a witness. The other ones are just coming in. Well, he can't have witnesses. He can't have anyone telling. So what does he do? Well, he just ties them up and kills them. 8 people. It was considered a crazy crime. And the ironic thing, or the coincidental thing, is it's pushed out of the news headlines a few weeks later by Charles Whitman, who we talked about before. But 1966 is when we start to see this sort of epidemic of mass murder in the States rear its ugly head. Richard Speck kills these women. Then he just leaves and he goes about his life of committing all kinds of different crimes. He has a tattoo, "Born to Raise Hell." He sees himself as an outlaw, as a sort of, anti-hero. And he was pretty bad at math because he lost count of the nurses. A ninth was hiding under the bed, and she was able to identify him. He also left his fingerprints at the crime scene. So there you have a psychopathic mass murderer, much different than a psychotic mass murderer like Jared Loughner. Okay, you can even see on his face there that there's just something not right with the dude. He was paranoid schizophrenic, pretty normal growing up, but used a lot of psychedelic drugs, and he either used way too many or he had a predisposition to psychosis in his family that these might have activated. But around August the 25th, 2007 in Arizona, he goes to a rally with Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, and he asks her a question. He goes, "What is government if words have no meaning?" Well, Gabby Giffords doesn't know how to answer that. It's that word salad we're talking about. It's the disorganized speech. It doesn't make any sense. All words have meaning. They symbolize things. That's how language works. So as she can't answer the question, she probably does her best just to skip politely over it and move on, Try not to make him feel too bad, but I can't engage with this guy. Then he just develops this paranoid theory that she is like one of the worst people in the world, a total phony and a tool of the system. He starts having all these government conspiracy ideas. And on January the 22nd at the age of 22, on January the 8th, 2011, he goes to another Gabby Giffords rally with a Glock 9mm, and he kills 6 people and wounds 13. Among the 13 wounded is Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. And before he goes and does that, he left a message on his MySpace that said, "Goodbye, friends. Please don't be mad at me. The literacy rate is below 5%. I've talked to one person who is literate. I want to make it out alive. The longest war in the history of the United States. Goodbye. I'm saddened with the current currency in job employment. I had a bully at school. Thank you. P.S. Plead the fifth." Does that make any sense at all? No. This is what we're talking about. The difference between the psychopathic mass murderer and the psychotic mass murderer like Jared Loughner. Then you have your psychopathic serial killers. Ted Bundy really needs no introduction. He hits pretty much all of those things that we've talked about on the psychopathic checklist and psychopathic crime scene behaviors. He has killed at least 30 women, but almost certainly more. He really didn't want to talk about that evasiveness, opening up to it. And as his death approached, he was electrocuted, capital punishment, 1989. They said, "Okay, Ted, is it 30? Like, do we have it right?" And he said, "Add one more digit to it, and you've got the right number." And so the optimistic go, "Okay, it's 31." But you could also argue that it's 930. We're never going to know how many people this psychopathic serial killer killed. And to end, here's an interesting story. The psychotic serial killers. Many psychotics, or at least people who are psychotic to this level, don't become serial killers because they don't get away with their first murder. I mean, they're that disorganized in their thought and behavior and forensically unaware that they just don't have the capacity to be a serial killer. But Richard Trenton Chase did. In 1977, in the Sacramento area of California, Richard Trenton Chase is paranoid schizophrenic. He's in a mental hospital. They call him Dracula in the mental hospital because he kills birds and other animals and drinks their blood. He's going all around his neighborhood. This is what gets him in there in the first place, killing animals and drinking their blood. He's found injecting bunny rabbit's blood into his own veins. So everyone at the institution is like, this guy's just completely crazy. Doesn't stop them from letting him out. And later in 1977, he's driving by. He just shoots a random guy out of the window of a car. Then by 1978, like January, he's going into these residential areas in broad daylight. He's a complete mess. He's like so identifiable, recognizable, disheveled hair, filthy, smelling, and he just breaks into these houses in the middle of the day and kills everyone in there. He mutilates and has post-mortem sex with the bodies of his female victims, and he takes like yogurt containers and he drinks their blood out of it. His final crime, he took a still living baby and carried it back to his apartment, where he killed it and put it in a blender and drank its blood. So you can imagine how much of a trail of evidence he's left by this point. This is where they finally come to his apartment and find this absolute horror show. And they arrest him and they start talking to him, you know, why did you do this? And here's his answer. Nazis were using UFOs to turn his blood into powder. The reason that he knew that was because when he went in the shower and lifted up his soap, it was gooey underneath. And if you have gooey soap underneath, you have soap dish poisoning, which apparently makes Nazis use UFOs to turn your blood to powder. That is not like Ted Bundy. They're both serial killers, but they are not motivated by the same thing. Ted Bundy is motivated to have sexual power over women as he pleases. Richard Chase is motivated by needing to stay alive because in his mind, his blood is being turned to powder by Nazi UFOs. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this lecture. We've got another one coming up on Monday. Motive for Murder. I hope you learned a lot about psychopathy and psychosis. I am Dr. Lee Mellor. Thank you so much. And I guess now would be a good time for me to open the floodgates and you guys can ask me questions. Just give me 1 second here. Did that rope go down? Give it a try at the front. There we go. Yeah, so I'll take any questions. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
It was awesome. Thanks.
That was really cool.
That was so interesting.
Yeah, thank you. It's difficult to condense all that into an hour, so I ran a bit over, but normally I'd give about 3 hours for that, so you guys got the crash course.
You did excellent breaking it all down.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So any questions? I bet you some of you are thinking, oh yeah, I know a psycho in my life, a psychopath. Everyone will have met one. 1% of the population.
It seems like a lot of people we know are psychopaths after what you said.
Right.
All this room is filling with psychopaths.
We all have one of those traits, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's it. We all get a score of 5. Mine's actually higher than 5, and I have no problem with that. I mean, like, you can be a little higher. It doesn't mean you're not. But you start getting up around 20, you know, that's when people are real problems.
Is there a place online where you can be tested on what your score would be?
No, actually, they keep this test pretty strict, and so it would have to be administered to you by a trained psychologist.
Interesting.
I could do it for you, but no, there's no sort of like self-report thing, and the reason for that is that psychopaths lie, right? Or they don't have great introspection, so a self-report test is not going to work with them.
Oh my gosh, that would be a great live stream to get my psychopath equivalency test.
Yeah, we could give it a try. I need some files on you. Have to contact the government, but we could do it.
I do actually have an interesting question. Although I know you're not a geneticist or a neurologist professionally, what do you think the chances are of, I know earlier in the lecture you had touched on the subject of how there's a possibility that genetics are influencing a lot of the behavior and predetermining like what's passed down from father to son or so on. Mm-hmm. And I had mentioned that it wouldn't honestly surprise me that on some level, genetics kind of predetermine the way your neurological structure maps itself out.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I feel like that's probably, what are your thoughts on that as far as like...
Yeah, you totally got it right. Of course, like our genetics determines how tall we are. It determines the color of our skin. It determines the color of our eyes. And it also determines the contents of our brain. So if you think that everyone has the same brain, you're wrong. And I'm not saying that you do, but there are people that think that we're just blank slates, right? We're not. Yeah. We're born with this whole genetic background. And so it's possible that you could have a father or mother or grandfather or something that has that psychopathic gene, which means that certain areas of your brain don't work well, but it can function evolutionarily. So let me give you some stats on psychopaths. We know that psychopaths tend to have more children than non-psychopaths, and that's because of that sexual promiscuity and that superficial charm. They can just get inside people's pants, impregnate them, or get pregnant by them, convince them that they're going to be there to look after it, and then just skip town and then do it again a couple months later. So psychopaths outbreed non-psychopaths. Here's where the check is, though. Psychopaths tend to have much shorter lifespans than the average person, and that's because they're always getting into trouble, whether that's criminal trouble or just thrill seeking that puts them in danger. So it's almost like they have a different reproductive strategy. They breed intensely within a smaller window of time just to reduce it to something that basic. Yep. Oh, just ask.
Oh, yeah, sweet. I just wanted to ask a question. I saw No Country for Old Men, and I've seen the film American Psycho, and I've seen like almost all the Hannibal Risings. I read somewhere online, someone said that No Country for Old Men was the best rendition of a psychopath they'd ever seen. Is that, in your professional opinion, does that sound about right?
Yes. So No Country for Old Men has a very believable psychopath in is it the Xavier Bardem character? Yeah.
I think so. Like yeah, the guy with the weird long hair and the silent shotgun.
Yeah, highly believable psychopath. Yeah, so Hannibal Lecter, not believable at all. It would take me forever to get into why. What was the other one? Oh, American Psycho, not believable at all, nor is it really supposed to be. Because, as you know, a big part of the story is, arguably didn't happen. But Bardem in No Country for Old Men is a great example of a psychopath. But the one that I would encourage you the most, if you're going to take this knowledge and go watch a flick tonight and see what a psychopath is, watch Nightcrawler with Jake Gyllenhaal. It would be what I show my class when I teach at a university. It's perfect.
Oh.
I wanted to ask, what is your personal opinion on the difference between psychopaths and sociopaths?
Oh, I should have got to that. Yeah, there's so much ground to cover. So a lot of people say it's the same thing and we're just using different terms. And it's like at some point they didn't really have a good clear concept of what a psychopath was. So they would take people with various mental disorders and they'd just be like psychopath, 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 psychopath. And so then it started to become sort of like a waste bucket category where it didn't really mean anything. When the 1960s came along, people started getting a little bit more hippy-dippy, feely, be nice to everyone. It's society's fault. And they didn't want to conceive it as it being something wrong with the person's psychology. No, it was society that made bad people. This idea that if we just tailor society correctly, that we can, stop these types of personalities from occurring. So then it became sociopath. And now it's kind of mixed up. Some people say sociopath to mean psychopath. Some people say psychopath to mean sociopath. But in the current usage, it is really more correct what I'm talking about here to say psychopath. And that is because of the biological aspect of it. Sociopath can be used. Some people do still use it, but it tends to refer more to somebody with antisocial personality disorder, somebody who has grown up in an environment where being criminal or being violent or lying, cheating is sort of the norm, but no matter how you're raised, it cannot result in the kind of just absolute psychological, I don't know what you would call that, stew of evil that is the psychopath. You could never raise someone to be that bad. So
makes sense.
If you think of, like, say, your typical gangbanger, right? Your guy on the corner who's in and out of jail, he's probably not a psychopath. He's probably a sociopath, if you want to keep using that word.
Yeah, I have another question. I read somewhere that online, or I think through word of mouth, that specifically a sociopath is someone who's developed psychopathic traits, but a psychopath is someone who's neurologically kind of set that way. Like I heard that a psychopath is more to do with the miswiring of the neurology, but a sociopath is more to do with antisocial personality traits that show up in clinical tests, right, or something like that?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. And so things like being financially irresponsible, being parasitic, being impulsive, committing crimes, explosions of rage, those are things that people can learn, right? That's learned behavior. But you can't unlearn empathy to the level that a psychopath has it, right? Like when we get to that core part where the amygdala doesn't work and they literally don't know how to relate to other people at all, they find no value in a regular conversation. That's not a psychopathic trait that can be learned from society. People can get more callous, they can get colder, but not to that degree. So you're right in a way, but you can't get like from socialization to full psychopath.
There's different clusters. There's like a borderline personality disorder, and they all fit in together somehow, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, this is getting into personality disorders, and it's something if I had another hour of lecture, I've got into with you guys. But there's a cluster of personality disorders called cluster B personality disorders. And in that, you'll find your antisocial personality disorder. That's your sociopath, right? And you will also find narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and something called histrionic personality disorder. Borderline and histrionic are more prevalent in female populations. Antisocial and narcissistic, particularly antisocial, more so in male populations.
I see. So what was... All right, I'll let someone else do it. All right.
I have just small question.
Sure.
So even if one person have only like one small how you say this in English? One small thing from the things that you said, the psychopath is, that sociopath is, and stuff like this. If someone have only one small things like wanting attention or taking over conversation or always invade your private space, so does it mean that he's a psychopath or
no?
I mean, does it make him psychopath, or you need to have like more serious stuff to be called a psychopath?
Exactly. So what I presented you guys with, none of these factors by themselves, or even if you have even if you have a few of them, it doesn't mean you're a psychopath. We're talking about a constant range of behaviors that we see in people, and once you start to see them, you can't unsee them. It's really pretty profound, actually. It changes the way that you view mankind. But no one thing, clusters of all the different things we talked about. They don't have to have all those things, but let's say that they have 20 of those things. Yeah, they're probably
so that score is based on the amount of different descriptions. Right.
Yeah, the amount of those items that they meet and the degree to which they meet them. So 0, they don't have anything in that item. 1, they have somewhat in that item. 2, they're like full blown in that item. So it's actually really hard to get up to a 30, believe it or not. And once you get people that are getting up to 30s, like they're so clearly evil that like you can just tell that 30 really is a good cutoff point. So one thing, we all have these things. It's when you have a bunch of them.
Have you ever tested somebody who knew what the test was about going in? Well, I imagine everybody does, right? And tries to get a high score? Like, have you, like, not just to be joking around, but somebody who's, looking to get a rise out of people to make you concerned that actually doesn't have these qualities? Someone who's like a pathological liar, or how does that like get roped into that grouping?
I never actually have met someone like that, but I do believe that people like that exist. But typically what we do when we're assessing someone for psychopathy is we need file information on them, like official file information on them, so that we can see when we do the semi-structured interview with them whether they're lying or not.
Oh, I see.
So if I look at this file and this guy's got a clean slate, or he has committed very few crimes, and he's obviously trying to convince me that he's a bad dude, I might give him a 2 for pathological lying. I might give him a 1 for grandiose sense of self, but ultimately he's not going to score as a psychopath even if he wants to.
That's right? The importance of somebody who's, what's the word I'm looking for? Skilled in giving these tests, and that's the whole reason to have somebody do that in the first place.
Right. You have to be trained in the instrument. I mean, this all gets very exciting once you leave here with this knowledge. I hope that you do start to see the world and people in a different way, but always be aware that there is.
I know a psychopath. Everyone's going to blame. Jesus
Well,
Christ.
I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're all going to start overdiagnosing, right? And then just be aware.
Call each other psychopath.
Just be aware of that, and then scale it back and come back to the items, and you will find that I'd say about 2 or 3 people that you've met, about 2 or 3 people in your life that really are psychopaths, and then a whole lot that aren't. They're just assholes.
So how do you earn the training to be able to administer these kind of tests professionally?
Yeah, so I went to a training session under Dr. Robert Hare, who was the guy that created the test, and I did like a 3-day course with him. They show videos and they give you file information, and you have to come up with a reasonably accurate score to pass, because they've already determined, is this person a psychopath or not, roughly what's their score. So you have to review the files and the videotape of them talking, and then come up with that yourself. Right now I'm qualified to the point where I can do it for research purposes, or I can lecture on it, like I am with you, but I haven't been so intensely involved in it where they would allow me to diagnose someone formally that would affect their future, and I'm fine with that. That's not what I do.
I'm good.
But from what you said, so a really clever psychopath on the first interview can actually also mislead you to think that he's not a psychopath.
Yeah, sometimes they're too clever for their own good. But yeah, it does happen. If you guys watch the show Mindhunter, the big guy, Edmund Kemper, the big guy with the glasses.
Oh yeah,
that show's awesome.
Yeah, so Edmund Kemper, he went in for killing his grandparents at the age of, I think it was 14. He was in a psychiatric hospital, and he had a genius level IQ. And so with this genius level IQ, he managed to, once again, conning, manipulative, he convinced the local psychiatrist at the hospital to let him help the psychiatrist administer the test to other patients. So then Ed learned what all of the right answers and wrong answers were. So when he came up to take the test himself, he knew exactly what to say and what not to say. They let him out, and then he went on to kill, I guess it was probably 8 or 10 other people. So
what's the argument with intelligent people? People who, this has been documented throughout history, that people who have very high IQ scores do not fit in with regular people, and naturally are going to be isolated and have all these crazy feelings, which could lead to psychopathy, right?
I wouldn't say it can lead to psychopathy, but it can certainly lead to, yes, isolation and resentment. And it's not like you need to be a psychopath in order to be violent or a murderer and to strike out against people. It's just something that we commonly find. But yeah, if you take anyone and for whatever reason you isolate them enough and they don't feel that like they're part of the world and that no matter what they do, they can't join society and be part of the world, a certain portion of those people are going to develop extreme resentment. And they'll lash out. And we're going to talk about one of those people next week, actually.
But that's more like an act of rage then, right? Like where someone just gets so like aggravated that they are exploding and then probably later regret it.
Yeah, like more of a misanthropy than a psychopathy, right?
Yeah.
Just a feeling like I am excluded from the world and no matter what I do, I can't fit in with it. And some people like that just deal with it. Others kill themselves and others decide they want to burn the world down with them. It doesn't mean they're necessarily psychopaths. But you could have that and be a psychopath too.
Well, I have one thought on Scorpion's assessment, like that. Like, I mean, when you look at the brain pattern, it looks that there's something clearly missing in the brain, right, for a psychopath. So would that not also, on average, relate to the IQ and make them less intelligent, or are those regions so separate that intelligence is not tied into it at all?
Yeah, the IQ of psychopaths is about the same as your average person. Yeah, they've done that test. It's about the same.
I was just wondering because, like,
no, that's okay.
I guess part of my question was, does the isolation and the resentment lead to brain impairment? And turning off some of those centers.
I think at a young age, it certainly can. So if we take a baby, it's lying in the crib, and it learns how to bond with its mother or father by that parent coming over the crib and looking down at it and making faces. People make faces with their kids. And like smile like this and then stick your tongue out like this, and they laugh and they bond that way. If you could imagine a child in that situation that is completely neglected and never has that sort of bonding experience, then their mirror neurons, their ability to recognize emotions on the face of others, may not develop properly. That's about as much as my pay grade goes with that. But yes, you're right. From a young age, that may contribute to it because their brains are still in development, right?